In this lesson, we're going to talk about inventions that have been developed as a result of designs in nature, but not just general principles of how the universe operates, but specific designs that have led to inventions that have changed all of human history in some cases. I want to start just by mentioning a quote by Johann Kepler. He was one of the original founders of modern science, one of the greatest astronomers who had ever lived. He said, as he looked at his work and people asked him where he got his ideas, that he was merely thinking his thoughts after God. Now, this was the attitude of most of these original scientists that developed the principles of modern science in the 14, 15, 16, 1700s. They gave the credit to God for their innovations, discoveries, and designs. I'm going to take you to a couple quotes from God's Word. One from the very beginning of God's Word, where God gave His initial command to mankind. This is Genesis chapter 1, verse 28. God said unto them, Be fruitful and multiply, replenish the earth and subdue it. Have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over every living thing that moveth upon the earth. Now that word, take dominion, carries with it the implications of studying, understanding, and controlling creation. That is, in essence, modern science. God told us to do science. You know, I like to think of all of creation, the entire universe, the earth, the animals, all that they contain. It's like this huge sandbox, and God gave us a sandbox to play in. I mean, in comparison to the genius of the creator of the entire universe, we are like little children, and God literally told us to go play in His sandbox because He knew we would learn from it. One other quote out of the book of Job. Job said, Ask the beasts, and they shall teach you. So there is no conflict between the study of the creation, science, and what we can learn from it, and giving glory for that creation to God. Now, I am sitting on an airplane right now as we start to talk about the incredible technological advancements that mankind has invented based on the characteristics of things we have found in nature. So I think you know where I'm going first, and that is the development of flight. For almost 6,000 years, we looked at the birds and we saw them flying, and we knew they were heavier than air. And I'm sure mankind, generation after generation, wondered, how can these creatures fly? I would like you to take a look at this montage of films of mankind's early attempts to learn how to fly. Now you'll notice all of these attempts, they are trying to imitate birds. Now most of them failed until we understood the principle that allowed flight, that air moving over a shape of a bird's wings is forced to move faster as the air moves over the wing compared to the bottom of the wing, which creates a difference in pressure. This is the major component causing lift, allowing airplanes to fly. The Wright brothers understood this principle. And in 1903, for the first time in almost 6,000 years from the beginning of creation, mankind achieved sustained powered flight. Again, I'm going to take you back to a vintage film. Right after that December flight in 1903, they came back and filmed the Wright brothers flying. Isn't that phenomenal? Now that was only about 120 years ago. Doesn't it look like they're having fun? They're banking and turning and soaring, coming in for landing. I mean, it just sends chills up my spine to look at the fun these original inventors of flight were having. And that led to other planes, that led to jet airplanes, that led to the space age, that led to the plethora of flying machines we have today, only a little over 100 years later. But it all started by looking at a bird's wing. I'm convinced that had we not been able to observe a bird's wing, we never would have learned to have flown. Now, that's not the end of looking at the designs from nature that led to innovations in flight. I want to take you to what I think is the most phenomenal flying machine ever invented. And it's not something made by mankind. It is a bird known as the swift. Nothing flies like a swift. Now, the interesting thing about a swift is this bird loves to fly. It eats while flying. It drinks while flying. It just swoops down and grabs water. It literally mates in the air while flying. They've tracked these birds. They believe these birds never stop flying except to build a nest and lay eggs. Other than that, they're flying continually. They fly higher than other birds. They fly faster than other birds. Imagine you're driving along in an interstate. You're kind of going 80, 85 miles an hour, and you're kind of looking over your shoulder thinking, boy, I hope a policeman doesn't catch me. And a swift comes along. It goes flying past you on level flight like you are standing still. In level flight, the swift flies faster than any other bird in creation, 105 miles per hour. During its lifetime, the swift flies 2.7 million miles. It's like around the moon and back 6 times, around the entire earth 100 times. This bird loves to fly. If you looked at the Wright brothers plane, if you looked at planes made during World War II and World War I, all these planes just had their wings stuck straight out sideways. But if you look at a swift, the wings are swept backwards, kind of at an angle back. Almost all modern airlines, almost all modern fighter jets, very maneuverable, energy-efficient planes have their wings swept back instead of straight out. Why did airline designers start to do that? Because of the design of a swift's wing. We learned from the birds as flight improved. The most hazardous maneuver in flight is landing, because as a plane comes into land, it has to slow down and slow down and slow down. Well, at some point, if it slows down too much, it loses lift, and it's called stalling, and the plane literally will start fluttering like a leaf. Many crashes resulted. Well, airplane designers again looked at the birds. Very large birds of prey like eagles and hawks. They have these feathers that are deployed in the front edges of their wing as they're coming in for their landing. Well, airline designers started to put forward flaps on the wings of airplanes to prevent stalling. They looked at the birds first and copied the design they saw in very large birds of prey in order to better control planes and allow more controlled landings. You see, all through nature, God has provided discoveries, designs, innovations that are there in the sandbox of creation, waiting for us to put them to use in other ways and other applications. Now, sadly, who gets credit for all of this unbelievable complexity and design? Students are trained. It's all a matter of adaptation or mutations or natural selection. It all just made itself. It all happened by random changes over huge periods of time. Now, we're going to end this lecture by showing that couldn't possibly be true. But meanwhile, let's continue to look at the technological inventions and advances that are developed by looking at what God has made. one of these creatures that has really, because of its design, created an enormous benefit for all mankind is a small beetle called the timber beetle found in Oregon, Washington area. Now, in the early 1900s, as logging was going on, the chainsaws were made with blades very much similar to just handsaws. Now, for instance, if you look at a handsaw blade, you'll notice it just has a series of sharp pointed peaked teeth. In a similar way, circular saw blades that are used in sawmills are larger in diameter, but they still just have these just straight little circular peaked teeth. And chainsaws of the day were made in the same way, with chains that went around and around, driven by a motor, and would cut through trees as these teeth would just chip away at the wood. Now, Joseph Buford Cox was a lumberman working in the Oregon area in the early 1900s, and he happened to stop one day for lunch, and as he was sitting there on a fallen down tree, eating his lunch, he noticed a small beetle, a timber beetle, come out and start chewing away at the wood fibers on the tree. The thing he observed was that the mandibles were like C-shaped, and they would move back and forth like scissors, and it seemed to be cutting through the fibers of the tree very rapidly and very efficiently for such a small insect. And it perked an idea in Joseph's mind. He thought, you know, the jaw of this creature doesn't have just little points. It has this C shape in its cutting instrument in its mouth. I wonder what would happen if I made this a saw blade in the same way. So he went back to work over the next few days, and he created a chainsaw blade that had a shape like this small timber beetle instead of the little pointy teeth like all saw blades of the day were made. The results absolutely astounded him. This blade far excelled any saw blade he had ever seen operating in its efficiency and speed with which it cut through the trees. It was by copying the design that God had put in this beetle that allowed him to orders of magnitude speed up the speed and efficiency by which we could cut through trees. He went on to establish the Oregon Chainsaw Company, which to this day is one of the major makers of chainsaws and chainsaw blades in the world, all based upon his observation of a creature God had made in Job that says, "Ask the creatures, they will teach us," literally means exactly what it says. Everything God has made is out there either for our benefit or to show us the genius of the one who is behind the design of such things. What we're talking about throughout this lesson is a subject called biomimicry. Bio meaning of biological origin, mimic meaning to copy. To copy something in nature that would lead to some development or invention. Now, I want to start, just like with flight, talking about major technological inventions which have changed really the course of history because someone has just observed something that God had made and put it to use. I want to take you back to 1868, an inventor by the name of Michael Kelly, who observed an Osage orange tree. Now you see a picture of the fruit of the Osage orange tree. I've actually been all over the world talking about the inventions from nature, and I show this picture to folks in an auditorium and ask them, what do you think this led to? Now as they observe it, I'll get answers like, oh, maybe basketball or medicine balls or just some sort of sports. No, it has nothing to do with any sort of sports, which I don't consider necessarily a major innovation of humanity. Rather, it involves something very, very different. I'll give you another clue. This product, to this day, 150 years later, still sells 200 million pounds per year. And if you put it end to end, it would be 1 million miles long per year from an Osage orange tree inspiration. Let me go back a little bit and lay the groundwork for why this invention is so significant. You see, in 1803, Thomas Jefferson made the Louisiana Purchase. It's considered to be the major accomplishment of his entire presidency. He doubled the land area of America when he bought the Louisiana Territory from France for $15 million. over 600,000 square miles of land was added to the United States for 3 cents an acre, the land bargain of the millennium. Well, that caused a westward expansion of America. Land grants were given. The Lewis and Clark was sent to explore this new area. And by the middle 1800s, America was just expanding rapidly westward. Well, in order to support this rapid westward expansion, port and supply cities grew by leaps and bounds, orders of magnitude. Chicago, St. Louis, Denver became major metropolitan areas. Well, to have a major metropolitan area filled with growing hundreds of thousands of people, you have to feed these people. And one of the most common, efficient, protein-rich sources of food were cattle, beef. Many, many more people could be fed from a single cow than from a single chicken. Well, in order to contain the herds, you had to fence them in. Now, in the East Coast, there were lots of lumber. Picket fences were very, very common. But as people moved into the Great Plains states, the large open spaces of the Great West, there wasn't necessarily readily obtainable timber. So people would plant hedges of Osage orange trees. You see, as you look at the branches of these trees, you'll notice there are very nasty looking inch-long spikes. So imagine trying to push yourself through one of these hedges with these long spikes sticking out. It would not feel good. Well, the cows don't like it either, so they would become contained. However, it may take 5-10 years to grow an entire hedge line in a field, to fence off a field to hold in the cows. Not a very efficient way of containing your cattle. But if you don't contain them, they're all over the plains, you're spending all your time chasing them, that's not very efficient either. Well, Michael Kelly looked at what is so effective about these trees. It's the spikes on the branches. And he realized, I could create the same thing by putting barbs on a piece of wire. As a matter of fact, his original company was called the Osage Orange Barbed Wire Company, the invention of barbed wire. As a matter of fact, when I was researching this, I ran across one report. It said it wasn't the gun that tamed the West, it was barbed wire that tamed the West, fed the nation, and drove the westward expansion of America. Sometimes it's the simple things that totally change our world. You understand, less than 200 years ago, paper had not really been invented and utilized by the Western world, by the Europeans, by the Americans. Now, the Chinese, about 1,000 years earlier, had started to use paper, but the process of really understanding how do you make paper had not been developed. I want you to try to imagine our modern world without any mass production of paper products. For instance, boxes. We would still be shipping things in barrels. Can you imagine building barrels to ship things? That was the norm 200 years ago. How about books? They would still being produced on scrolls or linen. The best substitute for paper 200 years ago was essentially cloth, very fine, very thin cloth that was used to print products. Fun stuff like paper airplanes. Can't have those if there's no paper. How about cash? Cold, hard cash. We'd still be using coins instead of flexible, easy to store paper money. And then, let's get practical. Who wants to go around and not find toilet paper in our bathrooms? Paper is everywhere in the modern world. So where did the Western world get the idea to develop mass manufactured paper? Well, a French scientist by the name of René Anton Romor was going for a walk one day through kind of an idyllic setting in the French forest, and he noticed as he was walking along, he found an old abandoned wasp's nest. And as he started to look at it, he realized what you have is in essence very, very much like a very fine paper of exquisite thin quality. And he thought, if this material was just a little bit more durable, if it could be manufactured in flat sheets, it would make a very good paper. How in the world does this little insect create massive sheets of what is in essence paper. And he started to observe and watch. How does this animal that was created by God know how to do something that mankind does not even know how to do? And he realized, after studying it and testing it, this insect would literally dissolve the cellulose fibril structure of wood using alkali chemicals, and form a paste with it and spread it in very, very thin sheets to form what is paper. And he realized this could be done on a very large mass production basis also. It literally led to the manufacture and production of paper products, cardboard boxes, dollar bills, sheets of paper, books, toilet paper. All of these things, all of these modern conveniences that we take for granted is the result of observing what God had already made and applying those same principles for our benefit. All right, I'm going to bring us to 1935 for our next discovery invention. This one was made by Paul Sperry. Now, Paul loved to sail. It was his hobby and probably his passion. He would even take his dog along when he went sailing. Now, to understand why this invention is so significant, again, you have to understand the time period. All through the 1800s up into the 1900s, cobblers were people who made shoes. And the bottoms of shoes were made out of the same material as the sides and the top of the shoes, and that was leather. And the idea of the bottom of the shoes was the more surface area, the more contact there was between the bottom of the shoe and the surface, the more friction there would be, and the more stable, the less slippage there would be on your shoe. And all the shoes were made this way, with very smooth or high surface area bottoms. Well, Paul Sperry noticed when he was out sailing that when a wave would wash across the deck of his sailing ship, he would often slip and fall. Meanwhile, his Cocker Spaniel was just like running back and forth across the deck and not having any trouble at all slipping and falling on the water that's flowing across the surface. Well, Paul was curious. I think curiosity is often what will lead us to a new invention. He picked up his dog, looked at the bottom of the dog's paw, and he noticed there were these leather pads, just like, in essence, the leather on the bottom of his shoe. But between the pads, there were grooves, V-shaped grooves. And he thought, I wonder if this is the key to the better traction of the dog. Paul went on to invent the original herringbone pattern on the bottom of a deck shoe. If you look at the bottom of almost any tennis shoe and automobile tire, you will see these V-shaped grooves. This allows water to channel away and not be trapped underneath of a flat surface, so that you actually have more traction by having these grooves, and especially in a V-shaped pattern, exactly like he observed around the leather pads on the bottom of his dog's paw. So modern tires, modern tennis shoes, modern shoes with traction are based originally on the design of a Cocker Spaniel's paw. All right, let's bring us more up into the modern age. Inventors are still using developments from nature to design modern transportation modes. For instance, has anybody besides me noticed in the last 10 years there has been a reemergence of these really ugly box-shaped cars? I mean, what happened to aerodynamically streamlined vehicles in order to get better gas mileage? Why in the world would auto designers go back to creating cars that looks like boxes? Well, the key turns out to be a pug-ugly fish known as the box fish. Here's a picture of one of these fish. I mean, it's literally like a square trying to swim through the water. As a matter of fact, Science magazine is quoted as having saying, this fish ought to be able to swim as well as a barn should fly. And that's what you would expect. I mean, it's square, for heaven's sakes. Well, not so much. You see, as scuba divers were out there on coral reefs watching the fish and the waters washing back and forth, they noticed the streamlined fish would often get flushed back and forth with the water. Meanwhile, the boxfish, they're just happily lapping their fins, and they're not getting swept around as much as the streamlined fish. And they started to think, why is that? They should be worse. They ought to be like a parachute being shoved back and forth. So researchers started to study this. Matter of fact, a car moving through air is in essence a vehicle moving through a fluid, a very low viscosity fluid, just as this fish is moving through water, which is a more high viscosity fluid. So they thought, what is the key that makes this fish so efficient? Turns out the exact design of the corners cause a reverse vortex to happen as the fluid flows past it, canceling out the drag effect. And they started to design automobiles based on the same design. Daimler Chrysler, as a matter of fact, had a concept car a few years ago exactly designed on the shape and the angles of a boxfish. Turned out this car got 70 miles per gallon and had extremely good maneuverability. All because we looked at what God had designed first and copied that design. The next invention is based on the smallest bones in the human body, which is kind of a good quiz question. What are the smallest bones in our body? Now, it's not our little finger or our little toe. Turns out the smallest bones in the human body are in our ear. They're commonly known as the stirrup, the hammer, and the anvil, and they're shaped sort of like that in our ear. Now, what do little bones in our ear lead to as a major technological advancement of humanity? Well, the discoverer of the principle behind these bones was not an inventor per se. He was a vocal pathologist. He studied the human voice. But he was also a very inquisitive man. You see, the reason he was interested in how do our voices work, how do our ears work, is because both his mother and his wife were deaf. And he wanted to understand, how does human hearing work? Now, this person's name was Alexander Graham Bell. And I have a feeling you immediately know the invention I'm talking about, the telephone. But the telephone works because of two key components. It has to have a speaker which can transmit sound into electrical signal, and it has to have a microphone which will transform an electrical signal back into sound. I want to give you a quote by Alexander Graham Bell as he was studying the human ear. Alexander Graham Bell said, "It occurred to me that if a membrane as thin as tissue paper could control the vibration of bones that were immense in size and weight compared to it, why shouldn't a larger, thicker membrane be able to control the vibrations of a piece of iron in front of an electromagnet?" Now let me explain what that quote means. Our eardrum is thinner than tissue paper. It's like a very thin little membrane. And yet a vibration the diameter of an atom, 1/1,000,000th of a meter movement of that eardrum moves against the bones that move fluid, that move little hairs, that send a signal to our brain that can be interpreted as sound. So this little membrane is moving these bones, which are then interpreted. Alexander Graham Bell observed all this, and he thought, I know what can create an electrical signal through a wire, and that's moving iron past a magnet. So if you could put a membrane and connect it to iron filings, iron particles, which then move them in front of a magnet, it would create a periodic electrical signal that could be sent through a wire. At the other end, you could take that signal, use it to move iron particles that move a membrane that then creates sound waves, and the same sound could come out the other end. A telephone has to have a way to convert a movement of a membrane to an electrical signal, and then at the other end, or at the speaker end of the phone, it must move that signal to move a membrane to make a sound wave. That's all a telephone is. It's understanding the principle of the ear that led to the development of the telephone. think of the modern world without cell phones, without speakers, without microphones, without any way of transmitting sound. It all came from the observing of an ear. Just an interesting bit of trivia. What was the very first message transmitted over a wire by an electrical signal? It's actually a trick question. It wasn't the first message transmitted by telephone, which was Alexander Graham Bell saying, "Watson, come here." It was actually a signal by Samuel Morse. He invented the telegraph, which was the precursor to the telephone. An electrical signal transmitted across a wire with Morse code. The very first message mankind managed to send over a wire was the message, "What has God wrought?" Wrought is an ancient King James word that means made. What has God made? Because what God has made is what has led mankind to so many inventions that have changed all of humanity, including the telephone. In 1889, the World Exhibition, which was the precursor to what we now call the World's Fair, was held in Paris, France. Leading up to this, they had a contest to see who could develop and construct the most phenomenal human building ever constructed. The Great Pyramid of Giza actually held the record all the way up into the 1800s as the tallest human structure for almost 4,000 years of human history. But a designer came along, his first name was Gustav, and he proposed a building that was 1,063 feet tall, the tallest building ever proposed to that day as the centerpiece for this World Exhibition in Paris, France. Now, all of the experts of the day, they looked at his design and they said, "This will never work. It is doomed to collapse. There's no way this building could ever stand. It's made totally of iron, and the mere weight of it will cause its collapse." But Gustav, he based the design on the human hip. He reasoned that if humans could stand with their weight not centered directly under the support mechanism, but the weight thrown out to the side, our hips actually are off to the side of the center of balance of the human body, then why couldn't we construct an even larger, heavier structure in the same way? Gustav's last name was Eiffel. And now you know where I'm going. You see, the Eiffel Tower, the support mechanisms are thrown way out to the side, just like our hip bone transfers the weight of the human body off to the side of the hip. The Eiffel Tower still stands today in spite of all the critics that said it would never withstand its weight and collapse during construction, because it was based upon what God had made first. Now, before we leave the subject of construction techniques, I want to take you to the original great exhibition of mankind. The original World's Fair was held in London, England in 1851. And once again, they had a contest. Who can create the most magnificent building ever made by mankind? Now, this time they weren't looking for the highest, tallest building, just something of fantastic artistry and construction techniques. Well, Joseph Paxton won the contest. And it turns out he wasn't even an architect. He wasn't an engineer. He wasn't a building designer. Joseph was a botanist. And as Joseph started to consider what would make the most fantastic building imaginable to showcase the technology of mankind, he didn't look to mankind, he looked to God. He looked at the giant lily pad. Now, these lily pads can be 6 foot in diameter, and a man can literally walk across them. Now, they're made of a little membrane, not much thicker than a thin sheet of cardboard or a thick sheet of paper. You would think he would just drop right through. Turns out these lily pads aren't just this thin membrane. They have a series of ridges, very strong, heavy construction ridges supporting the membrane underneath with cross tie pieces across through the main veins. Joseph looked at this design and he thought, how could I use this design in the most fabulous building ever constructed by mankind? And what he conceived was called the Crystal Palace. This building covered 18 acres of land. It was 108 feet tall, and it used 200,000 panes of glass. It was a building constructed essentially from the outside entirely of glass. Over 10 stories high, covering an enormous area of the Great and Grand Exhibition in London, England. And guess what? The experts of the day said, "It's going to collapse! There's no way that you could keep a building covered with the massive weight of all these glass panels from totally collapsing." But Joseph designed it exactly like the giant lily pad. Small intersecting supporting structures that were supported by main arteries. The inside of the building, you could see all of this structure, very similar to the bottom side of a giant lily pad, where from the outside it looked like just a massive glass crystal palace. It was based on the design by the great designer himself, the God of the universe. For our last subject, I want to bring us right up to the space age. Surely rocket scientists don't need to rely on God's design from nature. Au contraire. You see, one of the things needed if we're going to have people in space stations for long-term space travel, is to cheaply generate energy. And the way we do this in space is with solar arrays and solar panels. And yet these are huge areas to collect the sunlight that are very, very flimsy and fragile. How do you launch something like that into space? The escape velocity of spacecraft from the Earth's gravitational field is 17,000 miles per hour. You have to accelerate things at high G-force and high rates to get them into space. These flimsy space panels could never withstand those kind of forces. So you have to have a very large surface area for collecting sunlight, compacted into a very tight, compact space in order to launch it. Where do we find such a thing in nature? It's the bud of a leaf before the leaf unfolds. Watch this little montage of peach leaves unfolding, because peach leaves fold out into multiple leaves coming from a single stem that's all packed inside of a bud before it bursts open.
Most people, when they think of origami, think, my 8-year-old is doing origami. Why are these engineers at BYU working with origami? BYU's connection with origami began with the realization that origami was really a compliant mechanism. So a compliant mechanism is a device that gets its motion from things like bending and deflection instead of hinges and bearings. And we can actually make them very low cost sometimes. They can also operate in very harsh environments like the environment of space.
Origami helps inspire new ways of looking at how mechanisms can work or how we can approach solutions to problems.
It's very expensive, very difficult to get things into space. And the nice thing with a lot of origami is you can make it very compact for launch, and then as you get into space, you can deploy and be very large.
What you've watched, in essence, is the intricate folding of thin membranes. Origami is the human art of doing the same thing, copying the designs from nature. Even engineering colleges do exactly that, as you saw at the end of the video. And the engineer who designed the solar arrays for the International Space Station said they got their idea of the design from the unfolding of a beech leaf. Throughout this lesson, we've seen example after example after example. It is the designs from nature that has led to human developments. It's that sandbox God has given us to play in. And there's so much more to be learned. I implore young people to look around them and to realize there's a mastermind behind these designs of nature, which allow us to put these things to use and give us that inspiration. Don't be sucked into the fantasy that mutations and random changes and adaptation have turned land animals into sea creatures and bacteria into human beings. It could never happen. There are major issues, even with the final step, the idea that apes could have turned into humans, have enormous problems that have never been solved that literally show us this couldn't have happened. For the closing segment on discovery and design, I'm going to take us to a strange place. I'm going to take us to genetics. Now, why would I do that? Because the final culmination of this transformation of bacteria all the way to human beings is the idea that apes turned into people. Well, have they or haven't they? Dr. John Sanford is an expert in genetics. He spent his career at Cornell University. He invented what's called the gene gun, the ability to take some of the DNA code from one plant, place it into the nucleus of another plant, and change the characteristics of a plant. It is used widely in genetics across the world. This is a brilliant scientist who, for his entire career, believed in evolution. He believed that bacteria transformed into human beings, and he believed the evidence was from the area of genetics. And yet, as he continued to study, he realized if evolution's true, it's going in the wrong direction. Generation after generation, our genetic code is like a book where random letters are changed, and then that book is used to make the next copy where more letters are changed. And natural selection can't stop these changes. We now know, according to Dr. Sanford, that these mistakes are building up so rapidly, the Earth could not be millions of years old. There couldn't be millions and tens of millions of generations that have passed, because the genetic information would have been totally destroyed in that time period. Dr. Sanford realized this, and he spent several years writing a book documenting the evidence. Now, this book is called Genetic Entropy and the Mystery of the Genome. Why are we going to end a lecture on discovery and design talking about genetics? Because the final step of evolution would be this idea that apes turned into human beings, and the supposed strongest proof that this has happened for decades has been presented in the textbooks and the museums and in the media as being found in genetics. The 98% similarity between chimpanzees and human beings and other such statements. We're going to wrap up with Dr. Sanford, an expert in this field, talking about what used to be the strongest evidences that genetics prove ape to human transformation have now been turned totally around, and those are the evidences from genetics that are now showing us this could never have happened. I'd like you to listen very carefully to an expert in the field who will explain what science really shows us about where human beings have come from, where the abilities and the inventiveness of humanity has truly originated.
4 powerful arguments that actually disprove evolution have come to light in the last decade. And that's like, these arguments are incredibly strong. First one is programming of life. So I'd like to read a quote here from Bill Gates, who knows a little bit about computers, right? And so he says this: the understanding of life is a great subject. Biological information is the most important information we can discover because over the next several decades it will revolutionize medicine. Human DNA is like a computer program, but far, far more advanced than any software ever created. And in other words, the information system, just the information system within the DNA, is more sophisticated than our best computer scientists can program. Way beyond what they could ever accomplish. Oftentimes when people try to teach the idea of ape to man evolution, they use like an illustration, and so you just reshape a chimp into a human. But you see, what makes a human is the information. The human who has the genetic information necessary for doing calculus and sending men to the moon and doing art. They're programmed to be humans and to have human bodies, and that information is in the DNA. And chimpanzees are programmed to be chimpanzees and to behave like chimpanzees. They're really good at climbing trees, and they're really good at peeling bananas, for example. So this programming, it requires reprogramming. Now, one thing that computer scientists really understand really clearly is that programs don't arise by themselves. And you can't just trial and error try to improve a program. Well, let's just change a bit here and a bit there and a byte there, and maybe it'll morph into a totally new functional program. That's not how computer science works, and that's not how any information system works. Information is the product of intelligence. And so the information within a cell is staggering. I can't adequately explain it, except to say that the DNA is just the first level of the information. Here's a concept that I think everyone can grasp, is everything in the cell is talking to everything else. So there's crosstalk within all the components of a cell and between all the cells of a body. There's crosstalk continuously. It's similar to an internet system within a cell. And then we have 100 trillion cells in our body, and there's an internet that lets them talk to each other as well. It's staggering. Information is staggering. It makes information technology look puny. And so people, as we look at life and the way it's programmed, we should be in awe. How would you go about designing the human consciousness? Or creating musical genius? Or which nucleotides would you have to change to create those things? And so these things go beyond our comprehension. But God did it, and it's wonderful. And we are fearfully and wonderfully made. And more God is showing that through biology, through the highest level of molecular biology. He's revealing that to us. It's an amazing gift from God. The second problem is genetic entropy. And this is something I've dedicated almost 2 decades of my life to. This is something I've studied probably more than anyone else on the planet. And it has to do with the fact that the genome, as wonderful as it is and wonderfully designed as it is degenerating. It's coming undone. Just like everything else, you buy a new car, it starts to come apart over time. It rusts out and parts break. The same thing is happening in the genome, and this increasing disorder is something that can't be stopped. Natural selection cannot stop the degeneration of the genome. And so this is recognized as a huge problem by evolutionists. Scripture indicates that degeneration is happening. It says that we are dying people in a dying world. Genetic entropy is really easy to understand for us because it's a personal experience. We age and die because we mutate to death, literally. And so this problem of having the genome degenerate carries also into the next generation. And there's too many mutations. They're pouring into the human population faster than natural selection could ever remove them. We contribute 100 new mutations to our children, and our children contribute 100 new mutations to their children. So over the generations, each generation is more mutant than the previous one. So this is a grim and disturbing thing, and it causes us to ask the question, where can we put our hope? Put your hope in God. That's profound truth. The third huge problem is, can beneficial mutations override this degenerative process? And the answer is, basically, beneficial mutations are exceedingly rare. The probability that a random typographical error is going to improve a book is astronomically small. So one of the more famous evolutionary experiments ever done was done by Dr. Lenski and his associates at the University of Michigan. It was a great experiment. They wanted to know to what extent a bacterial population would adapt to an artificial environment over deep time. So actually the deep time is just a few decades, but they're talking about generations. How many cell divisions happened during that experiment? Somebody worked really hard, a lot of people worked really hard to keep those cultures growing for 30 or 40 years. Something like 60,000 generations. The analysis was really surprising because there was adaptation, which adaptation happens all the time. It's fine-tuning to adjust to a new environment. But what's interesting is that all the adaptations involve loss of information. Maybe 1 in a million mutations was beneficial. The one that they've made the biggest deal about was just a loss of promoter specificity. In other words, a promoter that used to be able to turn on and off was basically broken, so it was always on. And that artificial environment that happened to be good, maybe 1 in a million mutations was beneficial in their analysis. So basically, these rare beneficial mutations can't compensate for the vast number of mutations that are happening that are damaging. So the Lenski experiment has been promoted as a proof of evolution, but really it's a proof of reductive evolution. for good measure, there's one more. And this one I think is maybe the strongest, and that is the waiting time problem. And so I published this in a secular journal with a number of colleagues. Normally, if you change a letter in a book, you don't expect a dramatic improvement. You know, random letters don't help you. You need to put them in a certain order so you can make a word at least. So the problem is that the mutation rate is disturbingly high. If you look at our whole genome, we have about 100 new mutations per generation, but that's out of 3 billion letters in our genome. So if you're waiting for a specific letter to mutate to a single other letter, you have to wait a long time. So if we look at the contested bones, we put a graph in there summarizing this published work. And so basically it shows for one mutation in a population of 10,000, it takes 1.5 million years just to get a specific letter to change to a specific other letter. If you're waiting for two specific mutations, 84 million. So that's way beyond the 6 million years they say humans evolved. If you go up to 5 mutations, 2.3 billion years. 6 mutations, basically the supposed age of the Earth, 4.2 billion. That's just to get 6 letters in a row. Would be a very small word. If you're waiting for a string of 8 letters that would give you a new function, the waiting time is 18 billion years, much greater than the reputed age of the universe. That's crazy. The difference between chimp and human is approaching 300 million letters. So to get the information needed so that humans can be humans and have the brain functions we have and have science and art and all that, takes a huge amount of information, not just 3 letter changes, but extensive reprogramming. We're talking about amount of information equivalent to 2 words like thank you. And you've taken more time than since the Big Bang. So this is a profound problem. We published this a few years ago. No one's contested it. There's silence. This is a profoundly powerful argument against human evolution or any type of evolution. And it's been widely read. We can see that, like 10,000 people have read it. And not a single person has raised an objection who says, oh no, I don't agree with that, or it's not right. It is right. We nailed it. And they can't contest it. And it's powerful. It's the last nail in the coffin in a sense. And it's really, really exciting that God has, by His grace, released us from these false claims. He's made those go away. And then He's given us these 4 powerful arguments that are just dynamite. Hallelujah. Is the conversation over? No. What proof could we provide to show that human evolution is false that would make the world change its mind? There is no argument. The world has set its mind on this belief system, and it's not a matter of just science. It's primarily a matter of ideology. And so this isn't going to go away. One of the things that I've been asked, and it's coming from an atheist who's, he was being a little bit sarcastic. He's saying, so why did God make the apes? Was He just trying to make it look like we evolved from a lower life form? And I thought about that. I thought, God, it would have been a lot easier for me if you hadn't made the apes, because no one's going to believe that we came from dogs or horses or anything else. But I'd like to suggest that there's another type of design on a level that we haven't normally talked about, and that is what I call intelligently designed ambiguity. God could eliminate all the ambiguity. He could just show up, right? He will someday, but He doesn't. He tests our faith. And so He allows ambiguity. The evolutionists will always have arguments. And so people who are waiting to accept the Lord because evolution's been absolutely disproven, they're going to have a long wait. There will always be arguments. And so it becomes a matter of, do you trust the Lord or do you trust man? I've spent 18 years of my life looking at apologetics and defending from a genetic point of view Scripture and showing that the evolutionary paradigm, which I used to believe, that it's not viable. But all that is just to encourage believers to believe. But in heaven, when we meet the other believers, most of them will have never heard of Charles Darwin or the waiting time problem. They will have read and believed Scripture and trusted the Lord. And that trumps everything. So the reason for these types of scientific arguments is simply to remove barriers